Welcome and thank you for joining me for Tax Break. This is a podcast about South African tax for South African tax professionals and practitioners. My name is Pieter van der Schwan, and in each episode I share my thoughts with you on a topic or a recent development in South African tax. And I try to keep each episode just short enough that you can listen to it whenever you need to take a break. Now, with 2025 getting into full swing, I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about a topic that I received quite a few questions about towards the end of last year. And I would like to just explore the core tax principles relating to this again. The question is, if a residential property developer constructs property for purposes of selling it, but then ends up leasing these properties out to tenants, what is the VAT effect of this? Now, I guess one can speculate as to why the question came up quite a few times towards the end of last year. I would think it's probably the relatively high interest rate environment that made it difficult for buyers to afford properties or to obtain funding. But I'm no economist or property specialist, so what I can do is to talk about what are the tax implications for the developer then. Right, so if we look at the core principles in play, the first one is that if the property is rented out as a dwelling under an agreement for the hiring and letting thereof, that supply is an exempt supply. So in other words, there is no VAT on the supply, and because it's exempt, the property developer would not be entitled to claim any input tax on the inputs that it requires to make that exempt supply. If, on the other hand, the property developer sells the property as was the initial intention, then there is no exemption and the property developer can claim input tax on the goods and services acquired to construct that property. So therefore, what we're looking at is a scenario where initially the property was built to sell, in other words, to make taxable supplies. There was an input tax claim on it. And now we're moving towards the property being used for exempt supplies. Now, the issue is that once we move from making exempt, using the asset or the goods to make exempt or taxable supplies to making exempt supplies, this triggers an adjustment for VAT purposes. And it's an output tax adjustment. We find the adjustment in section 18.1 of the VAT Act, so 18 sub 1. And what it does is to say that if you've got an asset that was used for taxable purposes, that would now be fully or wholly no longer used for taxable purposes, you've got a deemed supply at the market value of that asset, not at the cost. So you've got an output tax charge on the market value of the asset, irrespective of what the VAT bearing costs were that you've claimed the input tax on. And SARS's view, if you look at, they've issued there's a few publications on this topic. One of them is Binding General Ruling number 64. What SARS's view is that this change happens as soon as the leasing starts, even if it is temporary in nature. So this poses two problems. The one is the question as to timing. That could be a challenge for the property developer, that you need to pay this output tax immediately when you start leasing. And then secondly, the quantum of it is that because the output tax adjustment is on the market value, not on the VATable costs, if we can call it that, it could be quite expensive when you trigger this adjustment. So previously, we had section 18 capital B in the VAT Act that then served the purpose of delaying the change in use for property developers for up to 36 months, as long as the leasing activities were temporary in nature. So it was a question of fact whether leasing was temporary or not. But this concession already ended in January 2018. Now, what we've got at the moment, and I guess in the absence of a concession, we are left with the provisions of Section 18.1 to trigger the output tax whenever the leasing starts on the market value. What we've had from the 1st of April 2022 is a new concession, and there's been a few refinements to it afterwards. So what the new provision we find in section 18D, and what this provision does is when the change happens, so when the leasing starts, it only requires the property developer to reverse the input tax that was claimed. So in other words, there is still an output tax adjustment, but it's not based on the market value of the property. It's based on the adjusted cost of the property, which is then defined to refer to the goods or services that were subject to VAT that you incurred in constructing the property. So there's a concession in the sense that the quantum initially is less than what your output tax on the market value would have been. This concession is, however, subject to the leasing being temporary. What the concession then does is to say that if you are still leasing it after 12 months, even if it is temporary then it bumps up the adjustment to the Section 18(1) adjustment. So you've then got to top up to top up your output tax from what it was on the adjusted cost to what it would have been on the market value under Section 18(1). And the way it does it, you've got your Section 18(1) adjustment on the output tax on the full market value, but then you've got an input tax adjustment that reverses your previous output tax adjustment. And the net effect of this is that you then have a bump up or a top up of the output tax. Now, unfortunately, this input tax adjustment, SARS refers to it as a clawback adjustment or clawback provision in Binding General Ruling 64. The wording of that provision didn't cover all the scenarios that could arise, and therefore SARS issued Section 72 ruling, which is then Binding General Ruling number 64. So if this is something that you're looking at, I think it is also worthwhile having a look at Binding General Ruling number 64. Of course, this scenario also presents some interesting income tax questions that it's beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, but I may cover that in a future episode. So in closing, the issue is when a property developer constructs a property to sell and then starts leasing it out, we've got a change in use. This change in use, what you need to consider is the timing of when it happens, as well as the quantum of the tax that results from it. Currently, we've got a concession for property developers that doesn't affect still when the leasing starts, there is a charge, but it gives a bit of a concession on the quantum. But if the leasing continues into 12 months or after 12 months, then you've got the top up. That's all for today. If you've got any comments for me, whether suggestions for future topics or comments on this episode, you're welcome to send me an email. My email address is in the show notes. And just a reminder, as always, nothing in this episode was intended to be tax advice or a substitute for tax advice. Until next time, goodbye.